For markets, businesses and workers in both countries, the message from the latest round of talks is clear. Despite all the rivalry, Washington and Beijing are not walking away from each other economically. They are trying once again to manage competition without blowing up the trading system that ties them together. At the political level, the signal has been just as deliberate. In a recent phone call, Xi Jinping told Donald Trump that the two countries should avoid turning their differences into open conflict and instead focus on practical cooperation. Xi argued that China and the United States can both win if they handle the relationship carefully. As he put it, China and the United States are fully capable of helping each other succeed and prospering together for the good of the two countries and the whole world. In that same conversation, Xi repeated a formula that Chinese officials now use constantly to describe their preferred approach to Washington: mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. Those phrases are more than slogans. They frame how Beijing is selling this new phase of economic engagement to domestic and foreign audiences as a way to shield growth from geopolitical shocks while still competing with the United States in technology, manufacturing and regional influence. On the American side, the tone has also shifted. Trump's latest national security strategy, released this year, softens some of the language on China compared with the previous administration. Instead of branding Beijing mainly as a global threat, the new document puts more emphasis on hard bargaining over trade, investment and industrial policy, and less on ideological confrontation. It still warns about security risks in the Taiwan Strait, but it leans heavily on economic tools and regional coalitions rather than open-ended confrontation. That change in tone does not mean Washington has dropped its concerns. The United States continues to impose tough export controls on advanced chips and other sensitive technologies, and it maintains high tariffs on a large share of Chinese imports. But the message from the White House, the Treasury, and the US Trade Representative's office is that complete economic separation, full decoupling, is not the goal. China and the United States are once again trying to turn confrontation into cooperation, this time through a fresh trade deal that both sides say is designed to expand areas of cooperation and stabilize a relationship that has rattled the global economy for years. In recent days, senior economic officials from Beijing and Washington have been back at the table. China's Vice Premier He Lifeng, the top official in charge of economic and financial affairs, held what both sides described as a constructive video call with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. The talks focused on how to implement the latest trade arrangement agreed by President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping during their October meeting in Busan, South Korea. That Busan deal built on a series of earlier understandings reached in Geneva and other cities this year. It committed both governments to trimming tariffs, relaxing some export restrictions, and restarting large purchases of US farm products in exchange for Chinese action on fentanyl precursors and continuing access to critical minerals such as rare earths. American officials now talk about de-risking instead of cutting ties. They want to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains in sectors seen as strategic, such as semiconductors, electric vehicles and critical minerals, while keeping space for trade in many other areas. That approach echoes earlier statements from former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who said the United States would seek a healthy economic relationship with China that benefits both sides and avoids a full rupture. The new trade deal, sometimes referred to by analysts as the Busan arrangement, fits into that logic. Under the agreement, the United States has pledged to scale back some tariffs, while China has promised to resume large-scale imports of US soybeans and other agricultural products, halt retaliation against US semiconductor firms, and ease export controls on rare earths and other key minerals. One of the most sensitive pieces of the deal is Beijing's handling of rare earth exports, the obscure but essential elements used in everything from smartphones and electric vehicles to missile guidance systems. After months of uncertainty, China's Commerce Ministry has begun issuing general export licenses for rare earths and magnets, a move that appears designed to calm global supply chains and reassure partners that Beijing will not weaponize its dominance in this sector, at least for now. Chinese officials have presented this as a good faith step following the trade truce with Washington. For European governments and manufacturers, it is also a relief. The approval rate for EU companies seeking licenses has reportedly climbed sharply, even as the bloc races to build its own mining and processing capacity. Still, nobody involved is pretending that all is suddenly well. The underlying tensions that drove the trade war have not disappeared. A recent economic analysis warned that China's current growth model, heavily focused on exports and industrial overcapacity, is increasingly coming at the expense of the rest of the world. The report noted that while US imports have risen this year, boosting demand globally, China has actually cut its imports even as its exports surge, widening its trade surplus and putting pressure on competitors from Europe to East Asia. This is exactly the scenario many Western officials hoped to avoid a decade ago. Back then, the assumption was that as China grew richer, it would import more, move up the value chain, and leave more space for others. Instead, the fear now is that China's industrial push, combined with large-scale state support, is undercutting foreign producers in areas like electric vehicles, batteries and solar panels, both in global markets and on their home turf. That concern sits in the background of every conversation US and Chinese negotiators now have about expanding cooperation. When He Lifeng speaks about stabilizing trade and creating a positive relationship, he is also trying to convince partners that Beijing will not use its economic weight purely as a political weapon, even as it continues to pursue self-sufficiency and dominance in key sectors. In his words, safeguarding the hard-won achievements in China-US economic and trade consultations requires joint efforts from both sides. For the United States, Besant and Greer face their own balancing act. They must show American workers and businesses that any easing of tariffs and restrictions brings tangible benefits at home, more predictable access to Chinese markets, more sales for farmers and manufacturers, and fewer sudden shocks in supply chains. At the same time, they are under pressure from Congress and industry lobbies not to sign away leverage that could be used to push back against what Washington sees as unfair Chinese practices. The Geneva Joint Statement earlier this year created a formal mechanism for managing these contradictions. It set up a standing channel where He Lifeng, Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer would regularly review trade measures, discuss new problems and try to prevent disputes from spiralling into another round of tariff escalation. The latest video call was one of those check-ins. According to official summaries, the three senior officials reviewed how far each side has gone in implementing the Busan deal, discussed the timing of further tariff reductions and license approvals, and exchanged views on broader macroeconomic conditions. Chinese state media highlighted their joint commitment to expand areas of cooperation and narrow differences, framing the talks as a sign that both sides want a stable, predictable relationship after years of rollercoaster tensions. Beyond the bilateral track, the wider strategic context is also shifting. In Asia, the United States has just wrapped up an ambitious tour, signing new trade and investment understandings with partners such as Malaysia, Thailand and Vietnam. These deals are partly about securing alternative supply chains for critical minerals and manufacturing, reducing reliance on Chinese networks, even as Washington and Beijing negotiate their own truce. China, for its part, is deepening ties with other regions as well. It has upgraded its free trade arrangements with ASEAN, and it continues to court European leaders with promises of market access, green investment and cooperation on global crises. Recent meetings with France's President Emmanuel Macron, for example, produced a raft of commercial agreements and public pledges to keep trade channels open despite mounting tensions with the United States. All of this means that the new China-US trade arrangement is about more than just tariffs between two countries. It is one piece of a much larger competition to shape the rules, standards, and flows of the global economy. Inside China, the leadership knows that growth has slowed and that domestic demand remains fragile. Exports and industrial output are once again doing much of the heavy lifting. That increases Beijing's need for open foreign markets and predictable access to inputs like critical minerals and advanced machinery, even as it pushes a dual circulation strategy that tries to insulate the country from external shocks. In the United States, the political climate is just as complex. The memory of factory closures, job losses, and hollowed-out towns still shapes public attitudes towards trade with China. At the same time, American companies rely heavily on Chinese suppliers and consumers, and investors want clarity after years of uncertainty. Trump's decision to soften the official tone on China in the national security strategy, while still keeping many hard measures in place, reflects that tension. Looking ahead, both sides have tied themselves to a series of milestones. China has pledged to buy large volumes of U.S. soybeans through 2028 and to maintain more open export policies on rare earths and other critical minerals, as long as the broader relationship does not collapse again. The United States, in turn, has agreed to roll back some of the steep tariff increases introduced earlier this year, provided that Beijing delivers on its commitments to crack down on illegal fentanyl precursors and avoid new forms of retaliation against American firms. Analysts note that many of these promises are front-loaded. The early wins, some tariff cuts, license approvals and headline-grabbing purchase commitments can be implemented fairly quickly. The harder part will come later, when both sides need to address deeper structural issues, from subsidies and industrial policy to data rules and technology transfers. There is also a political clock ticking. The next phase of talks is expected to coincide with Trump's planned visit to China next year, a trip that could either lock in a more durable framework or expose how fragile the current truce really is. Observers say the pause in tariff escalation opens the door for future talks, but warn that it will not automatically produce long-term peace in the economic relationship. For now, business leaders on both sides are reacting cautiously. Some are restarting investment plans that were put on hold during the worst of the trade war. Others are hedging their bets, diversifying supply chains to Southeast Asia or Latin America, even as they welcome signs of stability between Washington and Beijing. What is clear is that neither China nor the United States can easily replace the other. The two economies remain deeply intertwined, and no alternative partnership can fully match the scale of their trade and investment flows. That reality is what keeps bringing negotiators back to the table, even after years of tariff battles, sanctions, and political mistrust. The latest trade deal and the pledge to expand economic cooperation is an attempt to manage that reality rather than change it. It is a recognition that rivalry will continue, but that allowing the economic relationship to collapse would damage both countries and the wider world. Whether this new phase marks a real turning point or simply another pause before the next round of confrontation will depend on how faithfully both sides implement what they have promised and how they handle the next crisis when it comes. For now, the message from Beijing and Washington is that they are at least trying to move in the same direction. Xi summed up that hope when he described the basic conditions for a more stable relationship with Washington. He said that the two countries must work hard together so that their ties are defined not by permanent confrontation, but by the possibility of shared gains. In his words, for that vision to materialize, both sides need to work hard and in the same direction so as to realize mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation.